It was a gray Thursday morning in November, the kind where the rain against the courthouse windows created a steady, rhythmic drumming that usually lulled the room into a quiet routine. I had spent the first hour working through the standard docket, parking tickets, speeding violations, landlords disputing rent with tenants. The machinery of the court was moving at its usual pace, predictable and steady. There was no indication that the next case called would turn my courtroom to a theater of class warfare. Then the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't a noise, but a sudden silence. The heavy double doors at the back didn't just open. They were held open by private security. Two men in sharp charcoal suits walked in first, scanning the gallery with the kind of professional suspicion you usually see in movies, not in a municipal courtroom. They weren't police officers. They were private protection, expensive and imposing. Behind them walked Julian Thorne. At 26 years old, Julian was the face of the new economy, a tech mogul, a billionaire, a visionary, according to the magazines. He walked into my courtroom wearing a hoodie under a blazer that likely cost more than the annual salary of my court clerk. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look respectful. He looked bored. He checked his watch, a heavy platinum piece, before he even crossed the bar, as if the mere act of being here was stealing precious time from him. He walked with a swagger that didn't come from age or experience. It came from a life where every problem he had ever faced could be swiped away with a digital transaction. He was flanked by 3 attorneys, all carrying leather briefcases, all looking serious. But Julian was smiling, not a friendly smile, but a smirk. He whispered something to his lead counsel and let out a short, audible laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. It was a sound that didn't belong in a place of law. It was the sound of someone who believed he was visiting a zoo, not standing before a judge. Then I looked to the other side of the aisle. Standing there was Arthur Miller. Arthur was 63 years old, wearing a janitorial uniform that had been pressed clean but showed the undeniable signs of years of wear. His hands were clasped in front of him, rough and calloused, shaking slightly. He didn't have a team of lawyers. He didn't have security. He stood entirely alone, holding a crumpled envelope of documents in his hands. He looked at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with the young billionaire who was currently suppressing a giggle. It's just 10 feet away from him. The contrast was so sharp, it felt physical. On one side, youth, unimaginable wealth, and an arrogance that filled the room. On the other, age, labor, and a dignity that was currently being crushed under the weight of fear. I hadn't even read the full details of the complaint yet, but I knew immediately what this was. This wasn't just a legal dispute about property or damages. This was a collision of 2 different worlds. I watched Julian pull out his phone, blatantly ignoring the no cell phone sign posted clearly on the wall. His lawyer gently touched his arm to signal him to put it away. And Julian rolled his eyes, the gesture so exaggerated it felt like a performance. He viewed this court, this process, and this man, Arthur, as beneath him. And as I sat there, adjusting my glasses and looking down at the file, I realized that today was not going to be about statutes or fines. It was going to be about teaching a young man who thought he owned the world that, in this room, the only currency that mattered was the truth. The clerk called the case into the record. Arthur Miller versus Julian Thorne. Civil suit regarding personal injury, property damage, and loss of wages. On paper. The facts seemed almost trivial, the kind of minor dispute that usually settles quickly in a hallway. A collision in the underground parking garage of a high-end corporate tower. A luxury electric vehicle. One of those silent silver machines that look more like spaceships than cars, has struck a stationary cleaning cart. Not another vehicle, but a cart the tools of Arthur's trade. But as the clerk continued reading, triviality vanished, replaced by the heavy reality of consequence. The impact hadn't just destroyed buckets, mops, and supplies. The force of the vehicle had pinned Arthur against a concrete pillar. A fractured wrist, deep bruising, 6 weeks out of work. And for a man like Arthur Miller, an independent contractor with no paid sick leave. 6 weeks out of work didn't just mean a vacation. It meant 6 weeks without a paycheck. It meant missed rent. It meant choosing between heating and food. Julian's lead attorney stood up first. He didn't even look at Arthur. He spoke to the air, his voice smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of warmth. He called the incident an unfortunate mishap. He described the collision as if the car had acted on its own, minimizing Julian's role to that of a passive observer in his own life. He argued that the damages were negligible, claiming that Arthur had positioned his cart negligently in a zone reserved for VIP executive transit. He used words like obstruction and unauthorized positioning, turning the victim into the problem. I looked at Arthur. He shrank into his chair, making himself as small as possible. He looked down at his hands that were swollen, still wrapped in a brace, hands that had scrubbed floors for 40 years to survive. He wasn't just injured physically. He was being told, in sophisticated legal terms, that his safety was an inconvenience to a billionaire's schedule, that his existence in that garage was an error. Then came the moment that turned the air in the room cold. The lawyer mentioned the settlement offer they had initially proposed, a sum so insulting it wouldn't have covered a single emergency room visit, let alone 6 weeks of lost wages. We felt this was more than generous, the lawyer said, adjusting his silk tie with a dismissive flick of his wrist, considering the depreciated value of the cleaning equipment involved. That was when Julian laughed again. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a scoff. He leaned over to his attorney, loud enough for the microphone on the defense table to catch, and whispered, "My God, I spend more than that on lunch." He smirked, looking directly at Arthur, expecting the older man to understand his place. He expected the room to share in the joke, to agree that the suffering of a janitor was trivial compared to the finances of a mogul. But the room didn't laugh. The gallery went dead silent. I watched Arthur Miller close his eyes, his head bowing low. I saw his shoulders shake slightly. It wasn't from pain. It was from the burning humiliation of having his livelihood, his struggle and his pain reduced to the price of a rich man's midday meal. Julian didn't see a human being across the aisle. He saw a rounding error. He saw a nuisance. And in that moment of callous amusement, Ali checked his watch again. Julian Thorne made the biggest mistake a defendant can make in my courtroom. He showed me exactly who he was. I cut the defense attorney off mid-sentence. He was launching into a citation of a parking statute regarding right-of-way and commercial zones. He's trying to bury the human cost of this accident under a mountain of technicalities. I raised my hand, palm out. "Counsel, that's enough," I said, my voice low but firm enough to stop him cold. "I don't want to hear about liability codes right now. I want to hear from the man your client finds so amusing." I turned my chair toward the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Miller," I said gently, "please stand up." Arthur Miller rose slowly. It was a painful movement. I could see him favoring his left side, wincing as he put weight on his leg, clutching his injured wrist against his chest as if protecting it from further harm. He looked terrified. In his world, standing before a judge usually meant trouble. It meant you had done something wrong. He didn't realize yet that this courtroom was the only place in the city where his uniform didn't make him invisible. "Mr. Miller," I asked, "tell me what happened that morning. Not the legal version, your version." Arthur cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I was just doing my rounds. I've cleaned that garage for 15 years. I know the schedule. I know when the executives come in. I always keep to the yellow lines." He paused, looking briefly at Julian, who was now examining his fingernails with exaggerated interest. Arthur looked back at me, his eyes watering. I saw the car coming. It was moving so fast. There's speed limit signs, 5 miles per hour, but he was going much faster. I tried to move my cart. I tried to get out of the way. Arthur took a breath, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to scratch his car, Your Honor. That's all I was thinking. Don't scratch the car. But he clipped the cart, and it pinned me. I felt my wrist snap. I fell and danced. He didn't stop right away. He parked. He got out, and he checked his bumper first. A murmur went through the courtroom. That detailed check in the bumper, before checking the human being, hung in the air like smoke. Arthur continued, looking down at his hands. I've never asked for a handout in my life. I've raised 3 kids on this job. I've never missed a shift. But these 6 weeks, I had to borrow money from my youngest daughter just to keep the lights on. It's humiliating, Judge. A father shouldn't have to take from his children because he can't hold them up. He wasn't speaking with anger. He was speaking with shame. The shame of a man who defines himself by his ability to work, to Tate, and who had that ability stripped away by someone else's carelessness. I looked over at Julian Thorne. I expected to see, at the very least, a flicker of discomfort, a moment of realization. Instead, Julian let out a loud, impatient sigh. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering audibly enough for the front row to hear. Are we done with the sob story? I have a board meeting at 2. Huh. He didn't care. To Julian, Arthur's pain was just a transaction delay. He viewed the testimony not as a man bearing his soul, but as a waste of billable hours. He tapped his fingers on the table, a rhythmic, annoying sound that cut through the silence Arthur had left behind. He was bored by the suffering he had caused, and in my court, indifference to the pain of others is often a greater crime than the act itself. I turned my gaze slowly from Arthur to Julian. The tapping of his fingers stopped not because he had suddenly found respect for the court, but because the silence in the room had become so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the defense table. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice dropping an octave, echoing slightly off the wood paneling. You mentioned you have a board meeting at 2. Julian stood up before I even instructed him to. He buttoned his expensive jacket with a sharp, annoyed motion, treating the courtroom like a boardroom where he was the chairman. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his tone clipped. And frankly, this whole procedure is costing my shareholders significantly more than whatever Mr. Miller is asking for. If we could just write a check and wrap this up, it would be efficient for everyone. Efficient. I repeated the word, tasting the coldness of it. Please step up to the podium. He walked over, not with the hesitation of a defendant facing judgment, but with the confident stride of a CEO approaching a lectern to deliver a keynote speech. He rested his hands on the wood, leaning forward slightly, asserting dominance over the space. He looked at me directly, his eyes challenging, as if I were a middle manager he was preparing to fire. Tell me, Mr. Thorne, I asked, deliberately removing my glasses and placing them on the bench so I could look him in the eye without obstruction. When you struck Mr. Miller with your vehicle, did you see him? I saw an obstruction. Julian corrected me instantly, as if correcting a coding error. I saw a metal cart in a lane designed for executive transit. I have a reserved spot, Your Honor. It's paid for. That lane is supposed to be clear. If someone parks a cleaning cart around a blind corner in a VIP zone, they are accepting a certain level of risk. A risk of being crushed against a concrete pillar. I asked. A risk of an accident, he replied smoothly, unbothered. Look, I'm not saying I wanted to hit him. Obviously, I didn't, but let's be realistic. I drive a high-performance electric vehicle. It accelerates instantly. I was late. Time is money, Judge. Literally, in my case. I don't have the luxury of crawling along at 5 miles an hour because the maintenance staff can't follow protocol. Time is money, I echoed him. And what about Mr. Miller's time? He has lost 6 weeks of it. Does his time have value? Julian chuckled, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. With all due respect, Your Honor, the market determines the value of time. My time generates millions in revenue. His time generates clean floors. It's simple economics. That's why we offered the settlement. It was more than fair, based on his hourly rate. It was charity. Really? He said the word charity with such disdain, it felt like a slap across the face of every working person in the room. He truly believed that his wealth exempted him from the basic social contract of care. He believed that because his bank account was vast, his moral obligations were small. "You checked your bumper," I said quietly. "Mr. Miller testified that you got out and checked your car before you checked him. Is that true?" Julian shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference. "It's a $200,000 prototype, Your Honor. Custom carbon fiber bodywork. Difficult to repair. I checked for structural damage. Once I saw the car was just scratched. Then I looked at him. He was on the ground. He was conscious. I called my assistant to handle the insurance immediately. I handled it professionally." "You called your assistant," I said, leaning forward, my patience thinning. "You didn't call an ambulance. You didn't offer a hand. You didn't ask if he was okay. You called an employee to handle the mess." "That's what I pay people for," Julian replied, his tone turning icy. "To handle logistics so I can focus on the big picture." "The big picture." I nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Thorne, let me tell you what I see in this picture. I see a man who knows the price of everything: his car, his time, his lunch, but the value of absolutely nothing." Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He blinked. It was the first time he looked confused. He didn't understand. He thought he had won the argument with logic and economics. He didn't realize that in a court of law, humanity is the only currency that matters, and his account was overdrawn. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain against the windows seemed to hold its breath. I stood up slowly, not to leave, but to lean over the bench, closing the physical distance between myself and the man who thought he was untouchable. "You laughed," I said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Julian blinked, shifting his weight. "Excuse me?" "Earlier, when the clerk read the damages the cost of Mr. Miller's lost wages." "The pain he endured," laughed. I reminded him, my voice steady but hard as granite. "You leaned over to your attorney and joked that you spend more on lunch. Do you remember that, Mr. Thorne?" Julian sighed, exasperated. "Your Honor, I was merely pointing out the disparity. It was a comment on the scale of the lawsuit relative to my resources. It wasn't malicious. It was factual." "It was cruel," I corrected him, "and it revealed a poverty of spirit that no amount of venture capital can fix." I pointed a finger toward Arthur Miller, who was still looking down at the table, trying to make himself disappear. "Look at him," I commanded. Julian didn't move. "Look at him, Mr. Thorne." Reluctantly, Julian turned his head, his eyes sweeping over Arthur with barely concealed annoyance. "You see a janitor?" I said. "You see an obstruction in your VIP lane. You see a line item on an insurance form. But let me tell you what I see. I see a man who has worked with his hands every day for 40 years. I see a father who raised 3 children on a wage that wouldn't cover your car insurance. I see a man who shows up, rain or shine, to clean the floors you walk on, to empty the trash you discard, to maintain the building that houses your empire." I paused, letting the words settle. "You told this court that you are an engine of the economy. You believe you drive the world forward. But Mr. Thorne, men like Arthur Miller are the road you drive on. Without people like him doing the work you consider beneath you, your world grinds to a halt. You are not above him. You are dependent on him." Julian's jaw tightened. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. He wasn't accustomed to being lectured. He was accustomed to being applauded. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook, slapping it onto the defense table. He uncapped a gold pen, hovering it over the paper, and looked at me with defiance. He thought he could buy his way out of the discomfort. He thought he could pay a premium to avoid hearing the truth. "Put the pen away," I said. My voice didn't rise, but its intensity did. "I'm trying to solve the problem," Julian argued. "He wants money. I have money. What is the issue?" "The issue," I said, is that you think dignity is for sale. You think you can crush a man against a concrete pillar, laugh at his pain, and then throw cash at him to make him stop bleeding. I sat back down, picking up the gavel. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight. In this courtroom, Mr. Thorne, we do not auction off justice. You cannot write a check to fix your character. You broke a man's body with your negligence, and you tried to break his spirit with your arrogance. You wanted to know the value of Mr. Miller's time. We are about to establish it, and I promise you, it will cost you far more than lunch. Julian froze. The pen hovered uselessly in the air. For the first time since he walked through those doors, the billionaire looked small. The smirk was gone. The checkbook was forgotten. He finally understood that he was no longer in a boardroom. He was in a place where his net worth meant nothing and his actions meant everything. I looked down at the court docket, then back at the young billionaire still holding his pen, confused by the fact that his money had just been rejected. "Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice ringing with finality. "You seem to believe that the only way to solve a problem is to pay for it to go away. But there are some debts that cannot be settled with a bank transfer. Today, you are going to pay, but not just with your wallet." I formally entered the judgment. I am finding in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Miller, for the full amount of medical expenses and lost wages. That is the easy part. But given your conduct in this courtroom, you are laughter at a man suffering. Your admission that you checked your car before you checked the victim, and your attempt to trivialize this accident as a business expense. I am also awarding the maximum punitive damages allowed by this court for gross negligence and emotional distress. Julian opened his mouth to object, but I silenced him with a look. "I'm not finished. You told this court that your time is worth millions and that Mr. Miller's time is worth nothing. You are wrong. In the eyes of the law, every minute of a man's life carries equal weight. You stole 6 weeks from Mr. Miller's 6 weeks of his life, his peace of mind, and his dignity. Therefore," I continued, "in addition to the financial judgment, I am ordering you to perform 200 hours of community service. And to be clear, Mr. Thorne, this will not be consulting work. You will not be serving on a board. You will report to the city's maintenance department. You are going to spend your weekends cleaning the very streets you usually drive your luxury car through. You're going to learn what it feels like to be the person wearing the uniform, the person people walk past without seeing." The color drained from Julian's face. For a man who had built his identity on exclusivity and status, this was a sentence worse than any fine. It was a sentence of humility. "You laughed at a janitor today," I said, leaning back. "By the time you are finished with this sentence, I hope you learn to respect the men and women who clean up the world for you." I turned to Arthur Miller. "Mr. Miller, I want to apologize to you not on behalf of Mr. Thorne, but on behalf of a society that sometimes forgets that dignity is not a reflection of a paycheck. You stood tall today. You spoke the truth, and you reminded this court that character is not something you can buy." Arthur nodded, tears finally spilling over. But this time, they were not tears of shame. They were tears of relief. He stood a little straighter. The weight was gone. Julian Thorne left the courtroom quickly. He didn't swagger. He didn't check his watch. He walked with his head down, surrounded by lawyers who could no longer protect him from the reality of who he was. As the doors closed behind them, the silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. It was the sound of balance being restored. I gathered my papers, looking out at the gallery one last time. Justice isn't about destroying the powerful or glorifying the poor. It's about leveling the ground so that, for one moment under the roof of the law, everyone stands at the same height. I banged the gavel. Court adjourned. All.